All right, welcome to the week 2 asynchronous session. Today we are going to be talking about narrative and memoir. So our objective today is to be able to use narrative elements in memoir. So as you have probably noticed as you're working through Unit 2 this week, we are beginning our Unit 2 project, which is the beginnings of our memoir. You will be working on the brainstorming and the planning sections of your memoir this week in Unit 2, and then next week in Unit 3 is when you will actually write the memoir. So we're going to go through a few elements of the project today that you will need to grasp to begin working on the planning stages of that memoir. What is important to recognize is that you are writing a memoir, which is also a narrative. So my first question that I'm going to pose to you, and you're going to answer this for me below also in the quiz, is what is narrative? Narrative is basically a text that tells a story. So last week we talked a lot about informational text in our sessions, and we talked about how that informational text is utilized to persuade or inform. Well, narrative is the other option for purpose. It is to entertain us. So when you think about narrative, you think about stories. And the first thing that comes to mind is fictional stories, short stories, novels, etc., plays, and these are all a lot of times fictional, the stories that people have made up to tell. Well, the difference between that type of narrative and the type of narrative that you are going to tell is that your narrative will be nonfiction. So we talked a little bit about nonfiction last week too when we were discussing informational text, but this nonfiction narrative that you will be writing is going to be because you're basing your narrative off something that has happened to you. So when you think about the definition of narrative, which is a text that tells a story, you will be telling a story about something that has happened to you. Now, I don't want you to think that you're writing an autobiography because you're not. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between autobiography and memoir. They have a lot of things in common. For example, they're both told from the first person perspective because the person who experienced the story is the one telling it. So in memoir, you're telling the story from the first person, and you're telling the story from the first person in autobiography as well. So those things are similar. They're both nonfiction. They're both based in reality. So that's the secondary element of what they have in common. Where they're different is in the fact that memoir is telling you about a snapshot of somebody's life. Or autobiography is telling you about, hey, I was born here, and then I grew up here, and this is what my parents did for a living, and these are all the things that happened to me throughout my life, and now I'm 65 years old, and this is where I am. You aren't doing that. You're not going to write to me about the day that you were born all the way up through today at Primavera. You are going to choose an experience that happened in your life, a snapshot, which is what a memoir is. It identifies a time period or an experience or an event that was meaningful, and you hyper-focus just on that event. So let's take somebody like Michael Jordan, for example, or LeBron James, like some big basketball player. I'm going to go with Michael Jordan because I'm way more familiar with his career. So if Michael Jordan was going to write an autobiography, he would start from the beginning of his life, and he would tell, and he probably has written autobiography actually, but he would talk from the beginning of his life. I was born here, this is where I grew up, this is how I started playing basketball, these are the people that influenced me along the way. Then I played high school basketball, I played for University of North Carolina, then I went to the NBA, I played for the Bulls, I retired, I played baseball for a while, I came back to basketball, then I retired again, etc. So he's going to tell everything that happened in his life. If he were to write a memoir, he would choose one snippet of that whole timeline. So he would say, okay, my timeline starts here and it ends here. I'm going to choose just that time, like the year and a half or whatever it was that he played baseball. And he would just write about that little fragment of his life. That would be a memoir. Now, you are going to even narrow it down more because you are going to focus on an event that had life-changing impacts or had changed the way you thought about something or taught you something. It's going to have impacted you in some way. So I want you to start thinking about what that memory looks like. And then in the first step of lesson 6, which hopefully you've already completed since we're halfway through the week at this point, you are brainstorming different ideas for the memoir. So make sure you're not talking about your whole life. Make sure you're focusing specifically on an event that happened. All right, so there are a couple of questions below that you're going to answer. You're going to talk answer those few questions, and then you'll see me again. All right, excellent. So now it's time for our first part of our access code to get into the quiz. So the very first word of your access code is going to be banana. So now that we've covered what narrative is and the differences between memoir and autobiography, let's talk about the elements of the memoir that you're going to be working on this week in your brainstorming sessions. I put the prompt up at the top of the screen for you. It says, write a 2 to 3 page memoir about a real life experience you had that changed the direction of your life. Use narrative plot elements such as rising action, climax, and so on, and include at least one distinct setting and multiple characters. Write from a first-person limited point of view and include description and details that will help bring to life your setting and characters. Okay, so let's take a look first of all at up here at the top where I have underlined this statement, the direction of your life, and there's these little arrows here. So when it says change the direction of your life, this is the reflection piece of your writing. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, what reflection means in this piece of writing. That word reflection is really large. It's like reflection. It's like I'm yelling it at you. So one of the things that sets a memoir apart is that it does ask you to reflect back on your experience and explain to your reader why it was an important one for you to remember and why you're writing about it, basically. So you're choosing an experience that changed the direction of your life. Now, this doesn't have to be earth-shattering. It can be a moment in your life that maybe helped you determine what you wanted to do after high school, if you've had that revelation, and if you haven't, don't worry, I didn't have mine until I was 25. Or maybe you met a friend that changed your perspective on something. Maybe, you moved across the country and that changed the direction that you were headed. There are lots of different options. And if you get stuck on this and are having trouble brainstorming, I am an excellent brainstormer, so you just need to give me a call and I can help you. But reflection, when we look down here to the definition of reflection, think about looking in a mirror. When you're looking in a mirror, you're looking back at yourself. So in reflection, you're looking back on the memory and you're thinking back to why it was an important element or important aspect of your life. Reflection in memoir, which is this section right here, is important because it allows you, the writer, to say why your story matters. Why are you telling this story? What is this story about and why is it important? Why is it important for you to remember this story? What did you learn from it? If you can connect to your own memoir in this way and you can identify the importance of the experience to you and why it's important to you to remember it, that will translate to me, the reader. I will be able to see why this experience is important to you and understand your reflection, which allows me the opportunity to make a connection with you, the writer. All right, so I put an example up here for you of how to implement that reflection. Now, obviously, this is much shorter than yours will be, and it's a lot, more condensed. And if I were to tell this entire story, it would be very long. But the gist of it is that when I turned 15 years old, I got my learner's permit. I had never driven a car before, not even in the parking lot around, the empty parking lot with my parents. I never got behind the wheel of a car. So when I turned 15, I learned this important lesson. So an important lesson in my life happened the day I turned 15. It was also the day I got my learner's permit. I was so excited to drive, finally. I got behind the wheel of my mom's brand new car, 1 week old. It was 1 week old, and promptly backed it through the fence in my parents' backyard. I had forgotten to put it in drive. My mom, also, who was my passenger, she didn't get mad at me. She was compassionate and understanding. She taught me with her reaction that I was more important than her car, and it was more important for her to help foster my confidence level with driving than it was to get mad at me. When I think of that day, I reflect on her response, and now, as I have kids, I try to have the same level of patience and love that my mom demonstrated for me that day. So that's my reflection. If I'm going to tell the entire story of that, minute of my life where I backed out of the driveway, backed out of the garage and forgot to put it in gear and backed through the fence, I walk away remembering my mom's reaction her car really wasn't that damaged. The fence needed to be rebuilt. But she reassured me that I was learning how to drive, and it was better that I made these mistakes in the driveway and that I would get better with practice. She made me feel confident, and she made me feel loved, and she was very patient with me. And I try to implement that lesson every day with my children, especially around homework time. So I reflect on that. That's me reflecting on that experience. So when you write your memoir, I want you to reflect on your experience in the same way. So remember, these are the important things to take away. And reflection is thinking back, looking back on something, and then reflection in memoir is important because it allows you to say why your story matters. All right, so hopefully you got that first word down. The second word is going to be my dog's name, which is Bella. Okay, and last but not least, this is your last video. I want to go over the second part of the writing prompt. We talked already about the first part, which was the reflection. Now we're going to talk about the using narrative plot elements section. Now in your project for Unit 2, I mentioned in Lesson 6, you're going to do the brainstorm. Well, in Lesson 7, you're going to work on the plot, and in Lesson 8, you're going to work on the setting, and in Lesson 9, the characters. So let's talk about all of those things for a minute. When in the prompt it says, use narrative plot elements such as rising action, climax, and so on, and include at least one distinct setting and multiple characters. Okay, so let's talk about that element first. I put a plot chart on the screen, which hopefully looks familiar to you. My daughter, who's a 4th grader, just started bringing these home because they're working on identifying those narrative elements of plot. So you hopefully recognize that plot chart. If you don't, familiarize yourself with it a little bit. Now, I've labeled it for you, so you can see that we have here the introduction, the inciting incident, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. So all of those are what we call narrative plot elements. The plot drives your story, as does your conflict. So without a plot, you have nothing to watch. Nothing makes any sense. So the introduction is where you're going to introduce your setting and your characters, which are down here. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute. But your introduction to your story is going to be the introduction at least to your main character and where your story is taking place. Your inciting incident, which is this one here, is the thing that kicks off the plot. This is the first major event in your story. So you're going to start there, and then you're going to have what we call rising action. And these are events that move the plot forward and upwards towards the climax. So I put some stair steps here because plot elements in rising action build on top of each other to reach the climax. So you're going to step on, each incident up to the climax. So in a shorter memoir like this, you might have 3 incidents or 3 plot points of rising action to get to your climax. Or you might have 2 plot points of rising action, but you definitely have some rising action. Your climax up here is where we're going to have the turning point of the story or the most exciting moment in the story. For my example reflection that I gave you, this would be the moment I backed the car through the fence. Like the bang, the noise, the sound of the lumber falling and hitting the ground. That would be the climax in my story because that's where you're like, oh. And then all the falling action, this is more like a slide because it happens quicker than the rising action. So that's why I put the straight line there. It's going to go straight down to our resolution. So the falling action is, events that build towards the resolution that allow us to move from the most exciting moment to reaching that resolution of our conflict. So you, in your story, need to make sure you're including these narrative plot elements. If you don't include these plot elements, then you're not telling a narrative, which is part of the the prompt is to be telling the narrative. So in lesson 7, you are asked to begin plotting out or brainstorming those elements of plot. So you can just make little plot points like my introduction is going to be this, my inciting incident is going to be this. You don't need to describe them at that point, but you are laying them out in an outline format. All right, so the next part it says is a distinct setting. So the setting, as we can see down here at the bottom, the setting is the where. Where does your story take place? Is it in just one room in your house? Is it at the park? For me, a majority of my setting would probably have been in my driveway and in my car, mom's car. So the setting doesn't necessarily have to move from place to place, but it needs to be distinct. You need to be able to identify, your reader needs to be able to identify exactly where the story is taking place. You want to be able to describe what it looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, and we did some practice with that in our Unit 1 project with descriptive details. Secondly, you need to include multiple characters. I would go with at least 3 characters. So you need to think of an event that happened that includes at least 3 characters. Now, I know that some of you guys are thinking about writing about adopting animals and how the animals have impacted your life. And absolutely, the dog can be a character. I have no problem with it being a non-human character. That's totally fine with me, as long as the dog plays or cat or guinea pig or rabbit or giraffe or whatever the animal is, plays a prominent role in your story, because it needs to be a character that you can work with and develop in the story. You are writing from the first person limited perspective, point of view, which we talked about in the last video. You're writing from the I perspective. Remember, this happened to you. Only you can tell this story. So you're using the I section. The really cool thing about memoir writing is that you can be a little bit looser with your writing voice. It doesn't need to be so formal. You can let a lot of your character and personality shine through, which is my favorite part of memoir writing. So definitely let that through as you write. You're including description and details that will help bring to life your setting and characters. So here is where you're going to focus those details and that description. For setting, you really want to focus on, perhaps some sensory imagery, which is using the senses. Think about those 5 senses. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you touch? What do you feel? Include those in the story. It's way more interesting to hear what things sound like and look like than it is to just be told. All right, so those are the things you're working on this week in your brainstorm for Unit 2. Remember, Unit 3 is the actual writing of the project, so please don't write the project, the essay, and submit it in Unit 2, because you will not get credit for it. You are writing the actual essay in Unit 3. If you need help with any element of this project, or you aren't clear on any of the things I've gone over today in the asynchronous session, please contact me and let me know. I'd be happy to work with you on brainstorming, whether it's just the ideas you need help with or the building of the plot. I can help you with that too. All right. Go out, make a difference in somebody's life today. Be kind, smile a lot, and enjoy the rest of your day. Then finally, your last word is going to be my cat's name, which is Bear. So hopefully you string all 3 of those together. Don't forget to put spaces between them.